I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and I'm speaking with Dr. Andrew Hartz of Open Therapy Institute. And I think we have a good topic right now for today. It's how cultural norms shape mental health and interact with mental health, how mental health symptoms are expressed in a cultural context. Perhaps you
Yeah,
can get
perfect.
into
Yeah,
that.
that's great.
Yeah.
Let me tell you what the inspiration was for this, which I will give full credit to Dean McKay, because he shared an anecdote with me that really started me thinking about this question a lot. So he's an OCD researcher. He's a clinical psychology professor at Fordham, and he's done, he's president of ABCT, and he's done all kinds of amazing things related to CBT for OCD. And he said that one thing that he's noticed is that people that are coming in to see him where OCD symptoms are having different types of obsessions more and more. Not 100% of his patients, obviously, but more and more people are coming in with this presentation where they're worried about saying or doing something that's perceived as biased or un-PC and
Mhm.
then getting canceled. So they have these repetitive, intrusive thoughts about what if this happened? What if I said this? What if I did this? What if this happened? And that's the thing that they churn over and over in their head. That's their obsession. The repetitive, intrusive thought is about cancel culture. And this makes sense because people with OCD tend to latch on to whatever the most socially taboo thing is of the moment.
Mhm.
So a lot of times it's something religious or something sexual or something aggressive. And in this way, the symptoms for OCD are kind of like a mirror to the society because they're going to mirror back whatever the most stigmatized thing in the society is going to come up in the shape of those symptoms. So it's really kind of a kind of barometer of the social climate. Now, it's unclear the extent to which cancel culture is an additional stressor that's contributing to OCD. I don't think Dean McKay would say that. It might be maybe a little bit, but or to the extent it's really more the culture is shaping the way OCD manifests.
Mhm.
And so this says a number of things. First of all, if you're going to treat any patients like this, you've got to be comfortable with non-PC conversations. You can't see a PC therapist with these symptoms because they're going to be judgmental and say you're racist or whatever,
Mhm.
and shame you for it, which is counter-therapeutic. It also says something about how much people are impacted by cancel culture. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something personal. You can learn responses through observation. If you see somebody get bit by a snake, you can develop a snake phobia.
Mhm.
It's that type of thing. And seeing public figures or non-public figures, regular citizens, have their lives upended because they did something that was perceived as biased, and it might not have been biased, but it was perceived as biased. And then maybe they got fired, harassed, threatened, blacklisted. That sticks in people's minds. And it sticks in the minds of regular people. So cancel culture, it's not really just about celebrities. Obviously, it happens at universities and it does happen in the entertainment industry, but it happens in other places. It happens at law firms, it happens at financial institutions, it happens at hospitals, and people are terrified. And when you have, oh, you tweeted the wrong thing, you have a poorly phrased tweet, and now you're fired and blacklisted and humiliated on the biggest stage, that just sticks in people's minds. And it's not just, and so when I was talking to him about this, I thought this is such a fascinating topic about how the current cultural context is shaping symptoms, but it really became clear that obviously this isn't just OCD.
Mhm.
If you have social anxiety and you're at a place where all of a sudden everybody's getting accused of bias or sexism or racism or something, your social anxiety can latch onto it. If you're and now you're worried about that. Um, if you're depressed, your depression can lap onto it. Your feelings of hopelessness or isolation or pessimism can be exacerbated. if you've got an anger issue, substance use issue, interpersonal issue, it's happening in this context. And so I do think broadly this context of cancel culture is a psychosocial stressor, and I would expect it to contribute to mental illness. Not saying there's data on that, but that would fit. But it's also, I think, impacting the nature of symptoms, and what people's depression looks like, what their anxiety looks like, because this stuff is scary and it impacts people. And now it's not just cancel culture. I mean, related topic, but it's self-censorship is another cultural dynamic that, again, that's a stressor. We would predict that would impact mental health.
Mhm.
People are suppressing their thoughts and feelings, and that can make people inhibited or bitter or paranoid or angry or hopeless or it can foster self-hatred. It can do all these things. So especially in certain places where this culture is really strong, but that's even, that does include banks, it does include law firms. It's not just universities. That's a part of the puzzle of mental illness. And it's shaping people's lives in such a drastic way. It shapes how they date. Can they find somebody? Can they find somebody who is going to accept them for their beliefs and be compatible with them? And how's it going to manifest in that context? It shapes career choice. It shapes where you want to live. It shapes your values for what types of decisions you make or don't make. So all this is in the background of this cultural moment is how this stuff, not just it's bad and we think it's like cancel culture's, obnoxious or it hurts some celebrities and maybe a few people get really badly victimized, but it's actually something that lives in the psyche of everyone. Um, I remember reading a book about 10 years ago, and it took place in Bosnia, went under Ottoman rule. It's called The Bridge Over the River Drina. It was a really good book, actually. But the Ottomans were trying to build this bridge, and the local people were constantly like sabotaging it at night. They'd take the bricks down or something just because they hated the Ottomans. And so the leader who was in charge of building the bridge, what he decided to do was he caught one person doing something and took that person and very publicly and very gruesomely tortured him for hours and hours on end. And the whole town could, hear the screams of this person. And it broke the town. It broke everyone. And they just started working on the bridge. They gave up sabotaging it. There's something about the big public example of somebody getting ruined for something that can just crush people's spirits and make them obedient in a really powerful way. And I think we see something similar with cancel culture where you're like, that's what they tweeted. It's like, I mean, I know it's not the most sensitive way maybe to say that, but it's one tweet and it seems well-intentioned, and you're going to humiliate them and isolate them and ruin their career and ruin their livelihood and blacklist them. And it's terrifying to people. And it's demoralizing. So all this, I think the thing with the OCD symptoms is just an example of like, yes, of course this stuff is impacting people. Of course it lives in their psyche. Of course it shapes their thoughts and feelings. I'll give one, I know I'm monologuing, but I'll give one other example here, which is, the racial schema. A lot of people, I think myself included, 10 years ago, didn't think about race so much. I tried to treat people as individuals. I tried to be nice. I tried to not be bigoted towards people, but it wasn't something that was front of mind all the time. Now it's a constant cultural preoccupation. It's in the news, it's in politics, it dominates education, it dominates higher education. And it dominates entertainment, advertisements and stuff, where you're kind of like, okay, I realized like I just watched a 2-minute commercial break and there were no white people in any of the ads. I know something's going on. And like at some point, like I never really paid attention to how many black people were in ads, but like I can tell when all of a sudden this is happening. Like, and what it does is it heightens racial salience and it
Mhm.
heightens the schema of seeing race first. Everything from how movies are shot and scripted and what's made and what's not made and how the ads are scripted and the stories that are told and stories that are not told. It's really heightened racial identifications for people. That that has a huge number of psychological impacts where people are wrestling with how they identify, how they want to identify, how do they manage these new feelings around being messed with around race, around being forced into this racial category that is viewed in a particular way. You know, people are thinking about this and it's part of their mental life, you know. Obviously the same with like sexual culture, with culture around gender, with culture around this is real stuff that's impacting people. And I think this is a really important sphere of research for the mental health field to dive into more and really unpack how these things are impacting people. The trainings at work, the censorship cultures at work, the different types of cultural dynamics. I just read something that was like about uh, I don't know the methodology of the study, but it was saying something like a third of Americans think that they didn't get a job because of DEI quotas.
Wow.
You know, it's like having your career sabotaged because of discriminatory quotas, that's not a trivial life event. And but it's like, would that be expected to impact mental health? Of course. Of course. Not everybody who has that experience is going to get clinical depression. But if you have other risk factors and other things happening, it can add to your risk, and shape the nature of how that depression evolves and what it's focused on and how you experience your own race or your own gender. I mean, this is all stuff that's like, I don't think that we've really started really unpacking this material quite yet.
Well, yeah, you're really speaking to how not only does the changing cultural social taboos, not only do they change impact the way a person who would already be experiencing social anxiety, OCD, these kinds of experiences, the way that that manifests, but also how these pressures and like you that example that you gave from the book was really striking. And we are social ostracism and social being cast out socially is such a painful experience for people, and when it's done publicly on the public stage, it is a powerful disincentive to anybody who sees that to engage in the behavior that the target individual was engaging in. And so that creates all kinds of processes in that person, from social
Yeah.
dynamics to internal dynamics. And so not only are these taboos and these new cultural movements that we've been seeing creating or changing the manifestation of mental illness in people who would already be impacted, but it also creates a whole new set of pressures that can make people more anxious and more troubled and either either just emotionally disturbed or also actually impacted physically and socially. And like you mentioned with the job scenario, people who are afraid that they are not going to be able to get a job or have actually experienced not getting a job or being fired because of DEI quotas. Dating, that's a huge one. I've heard that from a number of people. I don't know if I'd ever find somebody who would understand me, or we'd see eye to eye, so I don't even try. These things have real life impacts.
Huge. And just pick one of
Yeah.
them and just sit with it for a second. You start to realize the depth of what's happening because a
Mhm.
lot of like you're talking about the public torture is a way
Mhm.
to discourage a particular behavior. But what's the behavior that's being discouraged now? It's joking with friends, it's
Mhm.
flirting with people, it's asking questions, it's engaging in dialogue, it's being creative. It's all this stuff that's like so essential for like a vibrant, positive society.
Mhm.
Um, and especially just the dialogue thing, not talking. Keep people self-censoring, keep people repressing stuff that they feel and think and experience. I mean, there's tons of reason to think that chronic systematic repression of strong feelings, a range of strong feelings, I mean, that can take a toll on people. And this the self-censorship thing, like just and I think like when we as our field hopefully has a conversation about each of these issues, they'll get unpacked more.
Mhm.
But um some things with the experience of self-censorship. Isolation is one. If you don't say what you think, you don't know who agrees with you or if anyone agrees with you, and nobody really knows you because they don't know what you feel and think about things. So the sense of isolation is huge. Um, Another one is like just the wear on the psyche of constantly repressing these feelings. You know, that could lead to fatigue, it could lead to anxiety. It could lead to sleep problems. It could lead to all kinds of others. So another one, a lot of people who self-censor, they start to wonder if what they think is crazy. No, everybody seems to be going along with an ideology that doesn't make sense to them. They wonder, am I really a crazy radical? Am I really an unhinged racist because I think racial quotas are wrong? Or because I think that, you know, racial aggression towards white people is racism? Am I really nuts? Because everybody seems to be going along with this thing and acting like it's normal. Now, a lot of them are probably faking it too. I mean, we know that, but it's like, but it creates this sense of, and then the self-doubts and people second guess them. A lot of people, and another thing too with this, a lot of people are success when content is that dangerous. If I think that, if I said that, my life would be ruined and I'd be publicly shamed and humiliated around the world for saying that.
Mhm.
That type of threatening material is really ripe for not just suppressing it, but actually deeper defenses of really pushing it into the unconscious and even using really severe primitive defenses to like splitting
Mhm.
because that content is so scary to you. I don't want to have that thought because that makes my life so much harder.
Mhm.
So the idea that think about it this way. For Freud, what he thought at least was that sexual repression, that sexual feelings were being repressed a lot and aggressive feelings. Those were the things that were driving mental health. Those were the threatening feelings that people couldn't handle. Repressing them was
Mhm.
creating their symptoms and creating all types of weird cultural dynamics and weird personality dynamics. It was related to repressing those feelings, you know. Um, if we're following that model, we would expect the same thing here.
Mhm.
Repress that lots of people, this content is really dangerous to think. It's really dangerous to feel. People are going to use defense mechanisms, even really primitive defense mechanisms, to keep it out of their consciousness. And that can shape their behavior in all kinds of weird ways. Most notably, if it's really dangerous to think this stuff, you can actually become a true believer in
Mhm.
it. You know, it's criticizing DEI is unacceptable, so you'll lead DEI because you can't tolerate your own repressed feelings about it. So just thinking about this stuff and how this is impacting people, this is our sociocultural context of the moment. This is, I think, the dominant force that's going to shape symptoms and how they're experienced psychologically right now. So
Mhm.
there's really, I think this is a vast area of inquiry.
I think that this is really important to talk about. And I think another important point you brought up is that a PC therapist isn't going to see this the same way. That's something that I have heard. I'm going to close a window because I've got a lawnmower outside.
Okay.
Sorry. But I have heard that from a lot of people who have reached out to me to see if I am taking on clients or if I can recommend someone who they can speak with, because their issues are not necessarily even related to some of the cultural taboos around DEI and race and gender, but they don't feel like they can speak openly with someone if they're risking running afoul of those things, and they're worried that the person that they speak with will be policing them on those issues. So that's a real concern. And then I also, as you were speaking about that, I was thinking about how COVID also presents this kind of cultural challenge. The COVID measures that were taken really isolated people, and there was a hard line on what people were allowed to say and uh, opine about around those measures. It wasn't something where nuance was accepted culturally, and so I think that that was another one that we're going to be experiencing a lot of repercussions and ripples from for quite some time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, how did masking impact people's mental health and their relationships? How did being locked down affect marriages and stuff? I mean, the field is going to be hesitant to write the study that says that this harmed marriages, or something, or hesitant to say this caused, I think some of that might come out,
Mhm.
but I do think that if it had been reversed, if Republicans had wanted lockdowns and masking and Democrats were against it, I think we'd already have thousands of studies documenting this stuff.
Mhm.
We don't because of the politics in the field. Um, yeah, and you don't always know how I think your patients are smart to reach out to someone that they feel comfortable talking about everything with.
Mhm.
Because I think people might say, well, I don't need to talk about politics. You don't know where things are going to go.
Mhm.
And you want to be with somebody that you don't have to agree with your therapist on everything. You don't have to talk about their politics in every session. You do want to have a broad alignment of values with your therapist.
Mhm.
I think that is important, and somebody who can get you and click with you and work with you well. Um, One other issue, I just saw a study recently that men who identify as feminists have a higher rate of erectile dysfunction. And the abstract of the paper said there's all these different reasons why this might be. Um, and maybe it's like they're less inhibited about admitting their erectile dysfunction. They're they're more sensitive to their partner's needs, and that might make them more self-conscious. There were all of these different, not one of the theories that was proposed was that they had an ideology that emasculated
Mm.
themselves. And that could be why they're having a hard time getting an erection. I it's just like the socio-cultural context matters. And if you have a set of values that says something about your sexual desire is wrong
Mhm.
because it's toxic or something,
Mhm.
could that impact a sexual dysfunction? Of course. Could that impact your sexual life, your relationship in all kinds of different ways? Of course.
Mhm.
But it's just like even in the study that showed that they couldn't suggest that as even one possible explanation for the findings.
That's really, really interesting. And it's interesting also in light of your comment or your observation earlier about people who reconcile dissonance within themselves in the direction of becoming a true believer.
Right.
I'm gonna be a champion for this thing because I can't quite manage some of my own nuanced thoughts around this.
And and what they need help with in a way is to actually be more comfortable with what they feel and who they are, and they're terrified
Mhm.
of that coming out. I think that I do worry about some of the people that are really active in these spaces because they often seem unhinged, they seem ungrounded, they seem there's something off, and you can kind of tell that there's a lot going on inside there. And I don't know. I think sooner or later that material will need to come out and be addressed with, and I think that'll be very difficult.
Something you talked about in the context of COVID, you brought up how these these ideological splits can impact intimate relationships like marriages. And
Mm,
I when I was in graduate school, I spoke with two different young women who are also in graduate school who both both told a very similar story. Both of them used, it was interesting, both of them used the word radicalized and said that they had been radicalized, but felt that this was a positive thing, that as women of color, they were radicalized by learning about these things, and they were now feeling more empowered to embrace that part of their identity. One of them was married to a white man and was now questioning why she had done that. Even though they had children together, she was questioning
Right.
whether she could love him, because marrying him might have been a manifestation of her own internalized racism. She might have wanted a white partner because of this. And so I was listening to this person who was actually talking about doubting her most intimate relationship based on this racial identity ideology. And another thing that we spoke about in graduate school when I studied human sexuality, we talked about the harm to trans-identified males whose wives leave them. So this was the way this conversation was discussed. There was this phenomenon of men realizing that they wanted to live as feminine and coming out to their wives, and wives not necessarily accepting this. And this was talked about in a one-sided way. We didn't talk about what that experience would be like for the wife. We didn't talk about that at all. We just talked about how devastating this rejection was for the trans-identified male. And so you have all these are kind of specific anecdotes, but they illustrate to me the ways that these hardline divisive ideologies are cutting through the most intimate relationships that we have. It's not just a societal bifurcation. It's actually like a splitting of human relationships, and in a really serious and concerning way.
Totally. I remember this was another story. I think it was a student in the Bay Area whose mom was Black, his dad was white. I think his dad had died, and he was in a class and he was doing one of these things where you divide up the students by race,
Mm-hmm.
and he wasn't comfortable with it and he was disciplined.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really clear that he loved and at least partly identified with his father and didn't think that this was, and it's just like, this is a whole, I mean, I think he was a lucky kid because the mom was totally behind him and thought this was totally wrong and really fought the school district on it. But, that's an adverse life event at the least,
Mm-hmm.
that's going to shape. And I think there's this sense about, this happens with religion too. Like patients kind of are like, oh, I don't need to talk about religion. I don't need to talk about politics. I don't need to talk about this. I'm just going to talk about my thing here. But it's like, you know, this stuff plays a role. I don't know how, I mean, maybe religion's not that important to you, in which case maybe you don't need to talk about it. But if it's important to you to see a therapist where you can't talk about it,
Mm-hmm.
that seems like a big impediment to the therapeutic process. And I definitely see sometimes, I don't think this is an unusual experience. If there's one thing you can't talk about, that can really block the flow of
Oh, yeah.
everything,
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how people do it. I saw this statistic. It was like 36% of people who go to therapy are conservative. And it's like 1 in 10 therapists are conservative.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think a lot of them just say, you know what, I'm just going to go for the thing I need. I'm not going to bring up politics or not going to bring up religion because I know they're not going to get it. And they try to get what they can out of it. But especially now where politics is everywhere. And I think people have a lot of thinking about, like we were talking about, like the ad break where everybody in the ads are Black for your 4-minute ad break or something. People notice all this stuff, but they don't talk about it. They're afraid to talk about it. And they're afraid to talk about it in therapy too. But it's that stuff, when Freud outlined, I'm very Freudian focused today, I guess, but when Freud outlined how to do free association, he said, say everything that comes to your mind And if you feel like something's not important or you'd rather not say it, especially say that stuff, because that's often more important.
Mhm.
Um, but there's so much in this culture that people don't share about with anyone, including their therapist. Like, this is on people's minds a lot. Um, and I think it affects symptoms, it affects treatment, it affects their lives, and
Mhm.
it's just being totally overlooked.
Your example of the boy who was mixed race,
Yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah,
an example of how it doesn't just cut through the middle of relationships, it also cuts through the middle of each person, a lot of these
yeah.
ideologies. And so that's a huge challenge for this person to be asked to carry and resolve. You must pick which race you identify with. It's unimaginably difficult. It being asked
I
by your culture, by your school to.
Well, they want, I don't know the details. I don't actually know the
Mhm.
details. If I'm remembering correctly, they wanted the purpose of those exercises is usually to isolate the white people.
Yeah.
So you want, so anybody who has any bit of non-white DNA
Mhm.
gets on the good side. They
Mhm.
don't have anything culturally in common with each other necessarily. They come from widely different parts of the world.
Mhm.
But so the function is really just to isolate the white people. But he's kind of like, I don't know if he wanted to be on the white side or if he just
Mhm.
felt uncomfortable
Just
not being,
didn't
but
like
it
the
was,
process.
yeah, yeah, because he knew, and it's funny how like, I don't know how old he was, 10 or something, how a 10-year-old can pick up on like this being wrong
Mhm.
at that level.
Mhm. That's something that gives me hope when you look at these kids who do see this and know that it's wrong despite what they're being taught. I think that humans have not only a great ability to perceive taboos, but also a great ability to really know what is right. And I hope that that's something we can be optimistic about.
Our field needs to be involved in helping with this.
Mm.
I really think that's a vital thing for the field to do, because when this politicized agenda kind of rolled out,
Mhm.
it was very disorienting.
Mhm.
I think a lot of people were like trying to get their head screwed on straight about what was happening and what they felt about it. They'd never really been kind of like punched in the gut so many times with these identity politics
Mhm.
ideologies in such an aggressive public way
Mhm.
and at work and all this stuff. And it was just kind of like disorienting. And I think a lot of what enabled them to spread so quickly was people didn't have counter arguments ready,
Mhm.
and their feelings were like confusing and their thoughts were confusing, and they're kind of like, well, I am against racism, so why don't I agree with I'm being told is anti-racism,
Mhm.
you know?
Mhm.
And it's taken time for people to formulate their experience and figure out, how do I feel comfortable speaking up against this in a way that's not hateful,
Mhm.
that's true to who I am, that feels constructive. And they need help making sense of this
Mhm.
and responding. And that's part of what we can do. Part of what we can do is actually formulate how this impacts people and what they can do differently about it. Um, with all of the issues that we've talked about.
I'm glad you're speaking about that because it kind of it ties into a question that I've had for some time, which is it seems like there's an inherent liberalism in the classical sense in therapy, in that you're there not to judge and tell another person how they should be living or what they should be doing, but rather to try to listen to them and understand where they're coming from and support them in the direction that they feel like they want to go without impressing your values upon them. And so if you accept that premise, then how does this field help show people culturally what a good life is, or what a good direction is versus are we just looking at data? Are we just looking at statistics and broad measures of human flourishing, or is there more to this conversation?
Oh, that's interesting. Like you're asking just in general about therapy and like what's the
Yeah.
it,
It
yeah.
it really struck me most when I was studying human sexuality in graduate school. And there's this, and I don't know how much of this is just because we have this really anything goes kind of sexual, our cultural sexual morality right now seems to be based on pleasure and consent. And
Right.
those seem to be the guiding, as far as I can tell, the guiding principles of our modern American teachings on sexuality and morals on sexuality. And the therapeutic perspective, as I was receiving it in graduate school, was one of just don't shame people, don't kink shame,
Right, right.
don't try to express. If you have different views, you're there just to listen, and it's not about telling people that they're doing something wrong or right, all the way down to really shocking things. Like I don't I've talked about this quite a bit on in other segments and other discussions, but we were given the example of our teacher was a working therapist, and she was working with a client who was doing scat porn, which I had never heard that phrase before, but I can picture what that means.
Yeah.
Um, and her challenge was not to laugh, which I thought was kind of sad that that was what she told us, that this, like, the biggest challenge was not to laugh, because I thought that would have brought up a whole lot of other questions about what was going on for this client. Like how does
Yeah.
what does that represent for you, and how did you find yourself doing that? How do you feel about doing this kind of work? Is, there's a whole lot of questions, but the way that we were being taught was to be ultra accepting and non-judgmental. And so there's this non-judgmental element here that leads to a challenge if you're actually trying to help people shape what a conception of a healthy life is. If you can't offer any framing for that, which it felt like the tools were being taken away to do that, then how do you help people work towards some healthy vision?
Well, it's like it sounds like the idea of being accepting and non-judgmental is don't think clinically about it.
Mm-hmm.
Act
Mm-hmm.
as if it has no meaning. Which is totally contrary to the way that therapy has been for a long time. Of course, this stuff has meaning to people. Um, and it might be, a false assumption that the patient isn't curious about the meaning that it has for him either.
Mm-hmm.
That might not be true. There's like it's definitely not true for gay men and lesbians. I'm not saying as 100%, but I know plenty that are curious about what their sexuality means to them and where it came from and
Mm-hmm.
how it functions for them. And it's definitely true for a lot of straight people who are also interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
I understand not wanting to be shamed by your
Mm-hmm.
therapist. That doesn't sound constructive, but the ability to think clinically, it's like turn your brain off when you see this and just be accepting. I'm not convinced that it's even going to come across as accepting if you
Mm-hmm.
do that.
Mm-hmm.
To not be more curious about it or thoughtful about what it means. Um, we should have a conversation about sexuality and what it means because I not now, but there
Mm-hmm.
are theoretical frameworks for thinking about that I think are deeper and richer than what is dominant in the culture, which is basically like if two people consent, then it's fine. But I mean, if somebody, for example, is like, yes, I have, I keep a roster of 3 guys or so that I sleep with. And whenever one of them drops off the roster, I go back on the apps and I fill it with another person. I'm always non-monogamous. And I've been doing this for years and I'm also depressed. And it's kind of like, well, is it possible that your sex life is playing a role in your depression?
Mm-hmm.
It seems pretty alienating,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe it's not for them, but to be curious and think about that conversation. There's no thought about what this stuff means because you have to just be accepting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would really like that conversation. I look forward to getting into that topic more because I think it's a big topic right now. We've kind of seemed to be culturally renegotiating a lot of basic things that were givens in just a couple of generations ago.
Yeah, people have really strong feelings about sex, and it's not just about consent or
Mhm,
stuff,
mhm,
and they're attached to each other and possessive of each other. And
mhm.
yeah.
Well, I think this has been a really interesting conversation about how cultural norms and cultural the zeitgeist is impacting people, how it impacts them in terms of generating issues, and how it impacts the issues that they're already having in terms of manifestation. And is there anything that you feel like we missed or that you want to go back and emphasize?
Well, just what you're saying about sexuality is just true for all of them, where it's like
Mhm,
the impact of self-censorship and how that plays out in the psyche and how it contributes to different symptoms, how it comes into the therapy room. What do you do about it? There's lots of questions with all of these to really
mhm,
dive into.
mhm,
And I think part of the part of the medicine here and part of helping with these issues is going deeper and really unpacking what's happening and thinking about it. And I think that as people do that, they're going to see it more in themselves and their patients and the culture, and they're going to get more ideas about how to address it constructively.
mhm. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's these kinds of conversations are a great start to that process, and I really appreciate having this time with you.
Thanks. Me too.
All right, thanks, Andrew.